Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm seeing lots of names joining this meeting. It's our final CivicSpark Poster Symposium session. Very excited to announce this session on building together engaging vulnerable communities. My name is Allie Keller. I am a project manager at LGC on the water team, and I've been co-leading our water network along with Savannah, who's helping me today. So a few logistics before we officially get started. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and message Savannah. I may or may not be able to see the chat throughout, but Savannah can help you with any issues that you may be having. And every fellow will have about 5 to 6 minutes to present, and then they'll have an opportunity for Q&A. Some fellows will be combining their Q&A with others in the cohort, so just be mindful of that. You can either ask questions by raising your hand and you can unmute yourself when we call on you, or you can include your question in the chat if it comes up while people are presenting, and Savannah will read those aloud, or I will read those aloud and ask the fellows to answer those questions. You can also feel free to use the chat to provide congratulations and well wishes to the fellows throughout, provide some positive support. We have lots to celebrate today and for the next week. We're also excited to announce that we have a new interactive tool that we can use and share with you all to show fellows their locations, their presentations through this mapping tool. So Savannah, if you could include that in the chat, that would be great, and everyone can check that out. It's brand new. And I think that's all. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Evelyn, serving with the California Office of Emergency Services, to kick us off today.
Awesome. Okay, so hi everyone. This year through the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, I got the opportunity to support the development and planning for Butte County's Children and Youth Task Force. The project originated in recovery from the Camp Fire in November of 2018, California's deadliest wildfire to date that burned through multiple Butte County ridge communities. Identified at the local level were gaps for systems to address the exacerbated needs for children and youth, particularly in mental and behavioral health, healthcare, and other social services. A promising practice that has been implemented in recent disasters to address effective coordination of the diverse systems affected is the Children and Youth Task Force model. So in the spring of 2019, the framework was socialized to the Butte County Office of Education after identifying their key role in Butte providing the hub for response specifically for children and youth the days and weeks following the fire. For this project, there was an opportunity to leverage the school community's role to build community-wide collaborative cross-sector relationships. So alongside a small group of local leaders, a contracted team from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Cal OES were brought on to provide technical capacity for recovery planning efforts. Key goals developed throughout this process to guide implementation included having local leadership, sustainability beyond initial campfire recovery, bridging silos, limiting collaboration, countywide ownership of the effort, and working alongside youth and families during the implementation process. So some key outcomes for this year included 7 key initial task force focus areas were identified. The task force was established with a kickoff meeting in late February with 28 community leaders representing a wide range of sectors. Recovery planning materials developed, including an implementation plan, best practices resource guide, and a county services resource guide as well. And then continued state support was also identified with the California Department of Education. There were some barriers we experienced in the development process this year, including an unforeseen administrative delay leading to the initial HHS team having to leave in September, but they were able to come back in January. The public safety power shutoffs in the fall had substantial impacts as well, especially on a rural county like Butte. And most recently, COVID, which limited the local capacity for leadership due to the shift towards response for this disaster over the past few months. However, next steps still persist and will include expanding stakeholder engagement and re-engaging folks that couldn't make it to that first meeting, engaging youth leadership and organizations to bring to the table, establishing work groups with actionable plans to address the 7 focus areas established, and then holding a second core meeting as well, hopefully in early fall of 2020. So if you could go to the next slide. Thanks. So a key part of the success for this project were the relationships made across local, state, and federal partners. Locally, champions included a small team from the Butte County Office of Education. State and federal partners included Cal OES and HHS, as well as continuing partner support in the California Department of Education. Due to CDE's strong relationship with BCOE, they were a natural fit to extend state support beyond this year. Through these partnerships, we were able to utilize state and local technical capacity to support local leadership in order to engage stakeholders across nonprofits, governments, businesses, recreation, education, justice, and even faith-based entities. These relationships also played a key role in gaining local context for ongoing community initiatives in order to avoid duplication of efforts in the county. Next slide. Initial insight on unmet needs were collected through a diverse cross-sector set of local leaders through 7 human service agency focus groups, 1 superintendent leader focus group, and a survey distributed to charter leaders. This engagement gave the opportunity to socialize the idea further out into the county and get more context for capacity of systems as well. So the 7 key focus areas ended up being mental and behavioral health, childcare, healthcare, transportation, emergency management, communications, and relationships and engagement. I think it's also important to highlight that emphasized throughout the stakeholder engagement process this year was the fact that many of these needs were there prior to the fire. Not only has Butte experienced disasters in the past few years beyond the Camp Fire, but they also had the highest percentage of adverse childhood experiences in the state of California prior to the fire. You can go to the last slide. So this last slide, I just wanted to include a piece that is within the implementation plan to visualize the 2 phases for ongoing task force efforts. The first phase includes most of what has been accomplished so far, with the second phase focusing on the sustainability of the work ahead, both within the core group and work groups to be created to address specific unmet needs. The process is meant to reinforce and give space for ongoing engagement by the CYTF, reflection on current needs, and ownership of this effort by its individual members. So yeah, that's my presentation. I want to thank CJ Hoff for being here as well. I think he's on here and he was one of the main champions of the work, an HHS contractor. And then I believe my former supervisor, Pune Simpson from Cal OES, who brought me on, is also on the call. So I want to thank her for being here. So yeah, I'll direct it to any questions that anybody has.
Question from CJ. Recovery environments are challenging to work in for a number of reasons. If you were to identify the one lesson you learned from this experience that you believe will be of value to you going forward.
I think the importance in, well, I think 2 things. I can never pick one, but the first would be to keep constant communication and relationships with the people that you're working with. I think although we had barriers this year, I think that's the one thing that kept the work moving forward was consistent communication and engagement with the people that you're working with. And then 2 is to just be uncomfortable with the uncomfortable that naturally comes with the emergency management space, for sure, and in many environments as well.
Piggybacking on that, Evelyn, thank you for this. This is Kif. I'm curious. I feel like I recall talking with you a little bit at the beginning and certainly with Pune about like this is the task force is both the community that you're serving and the people working to serve. It's a very, you know, they're both the participants and experiencers of these difficult situations. As we look forward, you know, trying to be mindful of both their impacts and their role in implementing it. I'm wondering how COVID is shaping that and people's ability to stay engaged.
Yeah, I think, you know, specifically with Butte County Office of Education, they were kind of the core points of contact and leadership in the planning process. And so I touched a little bit to their shift. They had to shift towards response, you know, their infrastructure, they're deeply embedded into the response with COVID. Obviously, schools is a huge topic for this entire year and disaster. So, but something that's been really inspiring and impressive to see is their commitment to this project still. I think although there's been many barriers, they have seen the consistent need for this type of initiative. You know, in building relationships this year, it's been analyzing the environment and seeing what's already being done in the community, not wanting to duplicate anything that's already going on, but this is specific to children and youth and a population that even before the campfire was historically left out and already had many just systemic issues. So I think although the COVID is a challenging thing, they're still able to work within their need within the environment to see the project through. And even in talking with other major organizations, there's still the drive and the hunger to move forward with this kind of work and addressing needs for children and youth. I believe, I don't know what questions are coming through the comments exactly, if you've been tracking.
Yeah.
There's a question from Jonathan.
I believe compensation.
Yeah, were the youth provided stipends or compensation in some way during this task force?
Yeah, so for the task force, the youth actually haven't been engaged yet. That's part of our next steps. I think some ideas that we passed on to BCOEs to engage them with some kind of school credit or leadership role within the task force. So that's a piece that I'm leaving with them for recommendations moving forward. I'm not exactly sure how, but it's definitely something that they're considering. I'm not sure whether stipends will be a piece, but yeah, we'll see.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Thanks for the question.
Great presentation, and thank you for your service. I'm now going to move on to 3 fellows, starting with Meet. Meet, can you start us off with your presentation? And again, this is one of the instances where we will wait till questions after the 3 fellows that are engaged in this one effort. Go ahead, Meet.
Thank you, Atlee. So my project is focused mostly, as you can read on the slide, it's called Action Planning for Equitable Water and Land Use Integration. And this was mostly focused on helping, just to give you context, help building capacity for both the local government agency of Borrego Water District, which is in Borrego Springs of San Diego County, and its community of Borrego Springs to meet its climate resiliency goals by integrating water into the existing land use and climate adaptation plans. So just to give a brief context again, so Borrego Springs has been an unincorporated community in San Diego County, which means that there has been no planning authority out here. The second fact is Borrego is 100% water dependent, and with the implementation of Sigma, the pumping has to be reduced by around 75% over the next 20 years. So the first project which I'm going to be talking about was the implementation of the groundwater sustainability plan, as the Borrego Springs Sub-basin was designated to be critically overdrafted by DWR, and it was critical to implement and develop a GSP by January 2020 to reach a sustainable yield by 2040, which again meant that there has to be a 75% reduction in the groundwater use of 2040. And in the past 6 months, in the first 6 months of my service, there was a proposed stipulated judgment which came out as an alternative for the GSP to achieve sustainability in Borrego Springs. And I helped on with the water district to build capacity by reviewing and researching the stipulated process, which kind of led to the Water Master Board towards the end of the year. And we also conducted 3 outreach and education workshops for the community members about the whole stipulation process. Borrego is also known to have is also severely disadvantaged. There are vulnerable populations out here, and including these populations like the Latinx community had to be involved and engaged in the educational outreach process. And this was kind of done through sending flyers in their water bills, because being a working class or a laborer, they wouldn't be able to like come for their outreach engagement workshops. And most of the families were also informed via this school community liaison. The next part of my project also kind of focuses on bringing land and water use together, as these two kind of go similarly hand in hand, but both of these projects kind of lead to a larger goal of action planning for equitable water and land use integration. So the next project kind of responds the needs and the impetus of an integrated planning process for the land and water use in Borrego Springs. Since it's so isolated, it's an isolated community and with limited resources. So bringing water and land use together, this was a collaboration of the Borrego Valley Stewardship Council and LGC. And during the last year, the community went through a planning process of integrating land and water use in an all-day community workshop, which was called the Scoping Proposal for Integrated Water Scale Planning Process. And this project kind of changed directions because there was a strong community input against the original intent solely being geotourism, but then it kind of moved into a much more balanced approach of having equitable water and land use integration. So I kind of built the capacity of the Borrego Valley Stewardship Council in this whole integrated planning process, and which led to a need, and they identified a community visioning, which required to be supported by the county. And this also led to a drafting of an action plan, which you all can see below. That was one of the major steps for focusing the Borrego Valley Stewardship Council into a community planning process, which would focus a lot on integrating land and water use and economic vitality and environmental health. And the next major step where the Borrego Valley Stewardship Council is to like broaden and expand its membership, because they want to keep it more equitable and also broaden their reach with other community members. And the action plan kind of also mentions the outcomes which will lead for the Stewardship Council by establishing establishing a 501c3 status, and then also securing funds for future development for this process. And this will also lead them to a community visioning process with this will also lead them for a community visioning process, which will be hosted later on, and it would lead to coordinating with the Community Department of Planning and Development Services to implement this community visioning in the community plan update of 2023. Next slide. So this is just an overview of the action planning, where the list of action steps would be taken by the Stewardship Council, and it's adopted in their MOU as of now. But because of COVID, they have been it's reduced the priorities have changed over time, but they would slowly change it once things start to become normal. The next slide. And this is just the community outreach process of people being engaged in the library, and the other one being in the school, where we also had a translator for other the Latinx communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Meet. Now we will hand it over to Caitlin to speak to her project.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin Macomber, and I served with UCA, which is Youth United for Community Action, a grassroots nonprofit based in East Palo Alto, which is in the Bay Area, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Bay Area. But I'd actually like to kind of start with the next slide I have, just to have some context in terms of where my project is based and the community I've served. So I wanted to share with you all the mission statement for UCA. So UCA Grassroots Community Organization was created and is led and run by young people of color, majority from low-income communities, that provides a safe space for young people to empower ourselves and work on environmental and social justice issues to establish positive systemic change through grassroots community organizing. So the whole community and the demographics and history of East Palo Alto is demographically and ethnically diverse. Originally, East Palo Alto was incorporated back in the late 80s and was predominantly an African American community. And then also throughout later decades, it has been a hub for also residents of Latinx community and of Pacific Islander descent. And so the basis of which East Palo Alto and UCA has been formed and grown throughout the years has been based in this small community that has been literally marginalized. I mean, if you look at a map, I didn't include one, but East Palo Alto is right on the San Francisco Bay, surrounded by Menlo Park, Palo Alto, Mountain View, and the Dumbarton Bridge. So based off of redlining and discriminatory racial practices, East Palo Alto has bared the brunt of a lot of historic and racial injustice, and also that shows through resource allocation and the lack of even say grocery stores or adequate supply of resources in that sense. So I'd like to go back to the previous slide to show my poster. Thanks. So with that being said, my project with UCA was initially developing an action plan similar to me. We're part of the same little cohort of NGOs here, but UCA, I developed an action plan for UCA that increases the understanding of key water, land use, climate, and equity issues among local governments and community allies within the region and locally, to build relationships with relevant agencies and organizations to partner with on integration, highlighting best practices to share with other partners across the state, which we'll talk about in the next section with the next fellow all together, and also developing local coalition building and implementing said action plan activities throughout this whole year. So I wanted to highlight in the top right quadrant is the kind of visual map of partnerships that UCA has had this year and has built and started this year, as well as had before my fellowship started. But I included the little acronyms because there's so many acronyms in everyone's projects, but I wanted to break it down for everyone. So UCA, Youth United for Community Action. SMC stands for San Mateo County, the Office of Sustainability, which is my primary beneficiary for this project. And CCCT is the Climate Change Community Team, which is a local coalition of community leaders in East Palo Alto that has been funded through San Mateo County's Office of Sustainability to do local coalition building work. And also UPI is Urban Permaculture Institute, which was the consultant and facilitator of a lot of sessions and meetings through the CCCT work that later UCA had built a direct relationship and partnership with. And CFWI is Community Foundation Water Initiative, which is the NGO cohort in which UCA is part of. And so the bottom three images and little descriptions I've shared with you all are kind of the three legs of the project overall. So to the bottom left, a highlight that we had this year was installing a rain barrel and rain garden on UCA's site, which is a house converted office. And so you can see in the bottom image, it's tiny, but there are more photos in the next slide, which we'll get to. We installed that back in December as part of the CCCT work that we have. We received a small grant through that, and as a demonstration project, UCA wanted to, get the youth members of UCA together and show them what can be possible. So we have that installed at our site, and the next part is the final statewide policy briefing that we created for CFWI. And so I'll touch on that a little bit, but alluding to it, this whole year has included a lot of research and preparation alongside me and Nicole, who will present after me, to create, and as well as the executive directors of our NGOs, to create a policy briefing surrounding equitable engagement through coordinated planning, which is the title of my poster. And so the final leg of the project, which is more of a specific UCA grown initiative, has been the launch of our climate justice and community resilience campaign aimed for the youth of East Palo Alto. So all of the work and research that has gone through both UCA specific and the CCCT and the CFWI has informed the inception of this this new campaign for UCA and partnering organizations within East Palo Alto. So that has actually been kind of starting as we speak for the most part, but in terms of moving forward after my fellowship, I mean, the basis of everything was to provide the research and understanding and, analyzing the gaps and creating literature reviews for all of this information to pass on to the UCA staff and youth members. And now that it'll be initiated and kind of full-fledged, I'm pretty proud of having to be a part of this whole experience. And I still want to keep in touch to, see the benefits reaped. So thanks. And you can go to the next slide, please. Here, oh yeah. So these are some photos of the community, or the climate change community team process that we've had throughout the year. This was all before COVID, before social distancing was practiced, but these were back in the fall and winter. And the two left photos show the different community member workshops and asset-based planning that was done on different maps of East Palo Alto to identify strengths, areas of improvement, and ideal things to incorporate into having green infrastructure and different climate adaptations for East Palo Alto. And the two right photos are the day we installed the rain garden and the rain barrel. And then next slide, please. And then here's just a cover photo of the website for LDC's page to link to our policy briefing and a draft guide of our principles, which we'll later get into. But thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for listening. I'll just start with highlighting the experience of my individual project before Caitlin and I will finally talk about the project that we were collaborating on. So for my service year, I was serving with ClimatePlan, a statewide network of organizations that are working to address the challenges at the intersection of transportation, housing, and climate. And my project was also in the San Francisco Bay Area, but it was more from a regional scope. I was looking to develop overarching principles to equitably integrate water into the regional transportation plan of the San Francisco Bay Area. That was a lot of words, but I think my main role was research and
in this report that I developed for this project, I highlighted the connections with housing affordability, water supply, and development, and how issues of equity can also arise within these interconnections. And so from this kind of research, I developed 2 principles, which are on the screen. The first is that MTC should continue to prioritize growth in high transit and high resource areas, on the condition that this growth doesn't displace low-income housing, place development in areas at risk of sea level rise or flooding, or displace agricultural and urban space resources. And I think this principle is really going to address the 2 challenges of prioritizing water efficient growth, mainly because this strategy creates development that in already developed areas, which tends to use less water than urban sprawl. And it'll also address housing unaffordability, which is because it starts by creating housing near transit. And this just shows like the this shows and addresses the interconnection and of the costs of transportation and housing. And then I think the second principle was that MTC should coordinate with water agencies to align funding and planning when possible. And obviously this is going to address the limited interagency coordination challenge, but also it's going to address unaffordable water, because water agencies have been expressing that there are unaccounted expenses, especially with like infrastructure upgrades, that may be addressed through other funding sources that are available to housing and transportation things. So just being able to talk about that and coordinate might make this issue better. I think I'll talk about the next steps, which are just to collaborate with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission to integrate implementation strategies and expand on the partnerships created during the project. And then I think on the next slide, it talks about process, which mainly is just like, I did the research through literature reviews. I talked with a lot of equity advocates and water agencies, and then I got their feedback on the report, and it made sure that everything that they were saying was also reflected accurately. And then I think key lessons learned from this project, they're not necessarily new. I feel like a lot of the fellows previously have echoed a lot of these things, but I think the first one is developing a common understanding of barriers and terminology to build trust. I think that was apparent from what the Metropolitan Transportation Commission has been saying, and in their efforts that they were doing to integrate water into the transportation plan, be transparent in how feedback will be used. I think I learned this from the interview process, and also just mapping out organizations can help with collaboration and time capacity challenges. And so I think I'll end my individual project presentation here, and then Neat can start talking about and introducing the statewide effort to address the gap between land use and water.
Thank you, Nicole. So before we jump into the CFWI policy briefing, I mean, both the 3 co-fellows, I mean, the CFWI fellows have, like, we didn't know the entire process when we got into it. So, but now the clear understanding of how everything works, it's based on the Community Foundations Water Initiative process, where there were 5 groups of foundations across the state of California, and they've been working together since 2015 to advance the sustainable water management solutions. And these 5 regions included the ones which we 3 fellows are located in, which is Central Valley, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, and Silicon Valley. And this initiative kind of partnered with Local Government Commission to develop a report on equitable integration of water and land use, which was released in 2019. And after that report, each foundation kind of selected a nonprofit in each region of those 5 regions in order to advance those reports, regional recommendations, and statewide strategies while building local capacity for coordination. We also had the first person in convening, which took place in 2019, in October 2019, where the CFWI co-fellows and I and the 5 executive directors of the nonprofit took part in a workshop, and we started outlining an action plan worksheet, which the projects that we individually presented was the action plan. And which also now takes us to the next process where Caitlin will talk about how we came across our statewide priorities.
So after that initial meeting in October, our cohort met virtually in December and the later following meetings we had. But from that December meeting, the NGO cohort identified to coordinate land, water, flood, and climate planning as the statewide priority for our policy briefing, based off of LGC's Bringing Water and Land Use Together report. Through January and February, the fellows and I researched initial state policy opportunities and presented our findings to the full NGO cohort of executive directors in order to discuss narrowing the content focus for said briefing. And then through the spring into our next meeting, which was in late April, we shifted our priorities and policy briefing format to virtual due to public health and safety concerns with the new pandemic. We also formulated and researched new policy concepts surrounding emergency response and management in the context of COVID, with coordinating public engagement as resulting as our final focus for the briefing. And by late June, the nationwide protests for Black Lives Matter against racial injustice and police brutality reinforced the need for our work to have racial and social equity at the forefront in all forms and aspects. This is reflected throughout our policy briefing in each section, which Nicole will elaborate on further of the full agenda and process.
Yeah, I think Caitlin was alluding to just like the policy briefing structure, in which we had a storytelling panel which outlined the gap with integrating land use and water regionally and how it related to public engagement. And this is the place where we really contextualize the fight against racial injustice and the pandemic and how it affected our regions. And then us 3 fellows presented, and then we had our breakout group sessions to discuss the guidelines. I think with the with the pandemic, we also shifted virtually, which meant that we'd have to change some things to make it more engaging and shorter. And I think one of the ways that we established would make it more engaging would be having poll questions throughout the presentation. And then just to touch briefly on the guidelines, I know Caitlin has talked about it a little bit, but they are on the screen. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but I'll give a high-level overview, which, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Yes, you should be able to access the recording. I could probably send that around in the chat. But there are 8 principles, and the main focus of them are to redefine what it means for the government to equitably and authentically engage in the with communities. And a lot of the principles focus on relationship building and creating a process where communities are actively engaged in making a decision that affects their community. And I just wanted to also highlight that these are guiding principles and they're in a draft format. So LGC is open to hearing feedback from you all if you were interested in looking at them. And I think I could stop here and open it up to questions for the 3 of us, whether it be about our individual presentations or the whole statewide process.
Nicole, I think based on timing, we will need to skip questions for you 3. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry. But if anyone wants to ask your questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. And Caitlin, Nicole, and me can try to answer them there. Thank you, you three, for your awesome presentation and for your service and working together throughout the past service year. Next, we have Jacqueline. Jacqueline, can you take it away?
Yes, thank you, Danielle. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Garcia. I am a water fellow serving with the Northern Delta Groundwater Sustainability Agency. However, I've been serving with the Freshwater Trust, which is a nonprofit quantitative conservation water organization. They're amazing. And so my project, engaging groundwater vulnerable communities in the Solano Sub-basin, really responds to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. And so if I were to paint a picture of where the Solano Sub-basin is, it's west of Sacramento. The northernmost boundaries start with the city of Dixon, all the way over to Vacaville. And then if you move southbound, when you hit the Sacramento River, you find Northern Delta communities like Rio Vista and Isleton. And so that's more so the location of where we focus this project. And so the Freshwater Trust received a Prop 1 funding, which is specifically for SDAC and DAC communities. And so if you take a look at this project overview that I have highlighted for everyone, it goes through the main objectives that I kind of worked through during the service year. And so the very first one that I tackled was identifying and characterizing our communities. And the biggest challenge I think that I had was looking at how DWR defines SDAC and DAC communities. And so I really worked to do kind of a community assessment of sorts, where we did additional analyses to gain a holistic understanding of all of the water vulnerabilities, which would make our target communities less resilient to groundwater management decisions in the future, right? So that was kind of the first process. And I looked at a lot of socioeconomic indicators, such as broadband accessibility, healthcare access, the number of insured adults. We even looked at, who owns their domestic well and who rents on a property with a domestic well. And so after we really had a better understanding of the communities, their vulnerabilities, then I kind of started to assess the community engagement strategy and address any gaps that I found within. I did this by applying an environmental justice lens. And so really what I found was that we had to be very intentional with our language internally to make sure that this process was equitable and that the outcomes of this groundwater sustainability plan in 2022 would be equitable as well. And so one of the main gaps that we found is that there aren't enough resources across the state to address, the linguistic isolation. So we developed a lot of tools, which you'll see in the bottom right quadrant. We have a bilingual microsite. Please check that out. Bilingual groundwater fact sheets, which have already been distributed to nearly 300 K through 12 students in the sub-basin, surveys. And so really my whole service was geared around planning and researching. The boots will really hit the ground for this project in the fall of this year and in 2021. So really my service was geared around developing tools and helping kind of guide the internal framework for this process to ensure that this groundwater sustainability plan in Solano will be reflective and robust and really, really true to the vulnerable communities to ensure their resilience in the future. So thank you all for your time. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them now or connect offline.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Well, people are preparing questions. I'm wondering, Jacqueline, you mentioned the concept of changing, you said equitable language internally.
Mm-hmm.
Examples of that? Yeah, so actually one of the best resources that I found that kind of guided my own thought and my own kind of tactics to tackle this internally was the Greenlining Institute's guide for equitable policy. And so really just driving that equitable language and being intentional with our language, both internally when we talk about, in our meetings, but also when we're writing these draft plans that will eventually be the plans that the community themselves are approving. Thanks, that's really helpful. Mm-hmm. Any other questions coming up in the chat? If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask. If not, huge round of applause. Thank you so much. And we will hand it off to Rebecca now.
Hi, so my name is Rebecca Berg, and this year I worked with the California Department of Water Resources on the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program. So under Proposition 1, the state was split into 12 funding areas, each tasked with developing a water needs assessment for the disadvantaged communities in their region. My beneficiary for this project was the County of Tulare, who's the grantee for the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program in the Tulare-Kern funding area. So I worked with the county to enhance their needs assessment and their disadvantaged community education and engagement program to maximize the benefits that their region received by this grant program. So for the disadvantaged community education and engagement program, this program worked to advance the benefits of the IRWM program for disadvantaged and tribal communities in the funding area by focusing on improving community and tribal outreach and education in integrated regional water management. Additionally, my work on the needs assessment involved ensuring that all necessary information for the region was included in the report and best represented the needs of this region at the state level. This was accomplished through my work on the interim statewide disadvantaged community involvement needs assessment report. So the purpose of this report is to represent the needs of each region to give funding areas and the state a better understanding of the water challenges and opportunities throughout California. The information in this report is being gathered from each funding area's needs assessment. The report highlights the challenges and opportunities identified through the program, along with the similarities and differences of water needs in disadvantaged communities and tribes across the state. This is currently an interim report due to the fact that 7 of the 12 funding areas currently have a finalized needs assessment. We are expecting the other 5 needs assessments in the fairly near future. And once those have been received, we will finalize the report with summaries from all 12 areas of the state. Some of those 5 funding areas have been delayed as a result of COVID, and others just started their grant program later in the process. So some of the goals of this project include to gain an understanding of the most prominent water needs and how to best address them, to develop tools to aid the funding areas in addressing needs and engaging disadvantaged communities and tribes, and to improve communication and relationships between governmental entities and communities. So some of the state and local level impacts of this program are to better communicate needs of local communities to the state, to direct resources where they are needed, to help guide future funding, to aid regions in better collaboration among themselves, and to share resources or best practices among communities and across the state. So for some next steps, for the Tulare-Kern funding area, this includes to incorporate findings of the needs assessments into water management and future planning efforts, and to continue to build relationships established during the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program to ensure that communities and tribal voices continue to be heard in water management beyond the life of this program. Some next steps for the statewide needs assessment include the expected release of the interim report in October. And in the future, once the 5 funding areas complete their needs assessments, those sections of the report will be completed, as well as the summaries of needs statewide, and that report will be finalized and released as well. And I would just like to thank the County of Tulare for hosting me, and it was really a wonderful opportunity to get to learn about water in California in the Central Valley, where that is not always a guarantee.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great job. We did have a question from Alexandra, just generally to speakers, but I can pose this to you, Rebecca, in terms of, especially with the needs assessment report, How do you bring community participation back into that report development?
So at the statewide level, one of the things that we're actually gearing up to do now is to send out that report to the grantees from each funding area to get their feedback. All of the information that is in that report came from their needs assessment specifically, but was summarized, and we want to make sure that the information that we are presenting is the information that they feel is the highest level that they want to present to the public. From the local level, a lot of community meetings were done, surveys were sent out to community members to get their input on water needs in the region, but it is a really difficult aspect of the program. It's the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program, and we want to involve as many of these communities as possible, but it can be really difficult to get as much buy-in as we are hoping for. We did do more extensive outreach with some tribal communities in the area, since this is a group of people that we've had difficulty engaging in the past. But we are currently working on a tribal engagement plan that has actually seen more tribal engagement just in the development of that plan than we've had previously. So that's been pretty successful.
Awesome.
Hey, Rebecca, this is Kif. I had the fortune to hear your longer presentation yesterday, which was really nice to see for DWR. And in that, one of the things you guys touched on, at least if I understood it correctly, was kind of some of the ways the state is approaching this work and the language they're using and the kind of the literal structure of their engagement. And that's one of the goals, was to improve that relationship. I'm wondering if you could just touch on that a little bit more and share with folks some of the feedback you gave from your ground level view, both you and Emily, back up to the state partners.
Yeah, so just from the high level engagement, we have gotten a lot of feedback from people involved in the program. One of the biggest things that we heard was there is some backlash to the term disadvantaged community. This is a term that some people find offensive, either because the name DAC, which is usually used, doesn't sound very nice, or the fact that they don't want to be called disadvantaged. In addition, the efforts of this program tried to push more tribal engagement. So there are some regions that included tribal in the name of their program. And so they actually changed the name of the program to include tribal in that. And that has been, it seems like a small step, but doing some things like that has really actually made an impact and has made tribes feel more included in the program. It made it feel like they're not necessarily considered to be disadvantaged when they walk in the door, but they are a separate entity. But that is definitely something that we have learned through this program and are hoping to adjust in the future.
That's huge. Thanks, Rebecca. And that's a perfect transition to Emily, who will be speaking next.
Thanks. So I'm Emily Ontiveros. I was also serving with the California Department of Water Resources, and also working within Integrated Regional Water Management and the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program. So the focus for my year was advancing tribal engagement in Integrated Regional Water Management, or IRWM. And I'm going to focus in this poster on the Tribal Regional Water Management webinar series, which was my major deliverable. So this was an event intended to provide information to tribes on IRWM, and also to IRWM practitioners about tribal engagement and challenges and successes in that area. So you can see the process there. We started with convening a planning committee of tribal representatives, and we actually started planning for an all-day conference, but due to COVID-19, we switched to a webinar format, a virtual format. So we developed the content for that. We also developed a lot of supplemental materials and resources that were geared towards tribes specifically. So just background information on IRWM, examples of projects that tribes have done through IRWM funding, and then region-specific information, a little bit about the structure of the region and the governance, so that if tribes are interested in getting involved at the decision-making level, they have a little bit of background knowledge. And then contact information and maps of the regions, and also maps of the tribal lands in those regions. And then we organized panels, identified speakers, and developed presentations with a lot of materials from the speakers. So this resulted in a 3-part webinar series. They were each 3 hours long and a week apart. And it was a pretty successful event. We had 130 to 160 attendees at each webinar. And through a survey question at the first webinar, we found out that a little more than 1/3 of the participants were new to IRWM. So we were really reaching a lot of people who hadn't necessarily been involved in the program before. So some of the key strategies that were important in the success of this were strategic outreach. So we informed people of the event through tribal networks like the EPA Region 9 Regional Tribal Operations Committee, which a lot of tribal environmental directors are involved in, and through tribal chairmen's associations around the state. We had really high tribal involvement from the beginning, like I said, through the planning committee. We also contracted with the California Indian Environmental Alliance to co-facilitate with us. And a lot of our speakers were tribal representatives, providing information on IRWM from a tribal perspective and tribal experiences. And lastly, we had a tribal caucus that was really important and we got a lot of positive feedback on. So that was a tribal only session, and it was just really important to provide tribes that space to discuss among themselves. And that's where a lot of our recommendations came out of through that session, although we discussed them throughout the event. So that was the major outcome, was a list of recommendations for tribes, recommendations for regional water management groups, and recommendations for the state. So we're gonna be going through those recommendations as next steps and implementing those when feasible, and considering how those can better tribal engagement in the future. And most immediately, the next step will be to use those recommendations and think about the next round of IRWM implementation funding, which starts next year, and provide more resources to tribes on actually getting that funding to implement projects. So workshops and additional guidance on compliance and requirements will all be helpful for them. So that's next steps for the next fellow who'll be working with DWR. And I hope this can provide sort of a template for people who want to, or because of COVID, need to virtually engage with tribes. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
We do have a question that's broadly to the fellows, but maybe Emily, some of your work will speak to this. Can we get a sense of how much maps, graphs, and infographics helped fellows move past language and other communication barriers?
So for us, maps were really the big visual thing we provided through the webinar series. And it is really important especially for tribes who have tribal lands, to see themselves represented on those maps. And that information has to continue to be updated because tribal lands change over time. And also we discussed during the webinar series, how can we represent non-federally recognized tribes on those maps who don't necessarily have tribal lands. So we don't have specific boundaries for them, but they have ancestral lands. So that's something that we're considering after the webinar series, about how can we get that information and accurately represent them in a map as well.
That's really, really good to know. Other questions? Okay. Thank you, Emily. Great job. Next, we have Bailey. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bailey Lai, and today I'm going to be talking about my service here with the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, assisting them in their implementation of the Disadvantaged Communities Involvement Program. So to give a brief background, the Disadvantaged Communities Involvement Program, or DCI, was formulated based off of SAPA's One Water or One Watershed plan, which is SAPA's version of the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan that was discussed previously. So through OWOW, SAPA received DWR funds for its DCI program in order to first create an ethnographic strength and needs assessment of structurally disempowered communities in the watershed, which informed a variety of tasks, which included but are not limited to the Watershed Ambassadors Program, community listening sessions, tribal outreach, among a host of other outreach and engagement activities. This led to SAPA's allocation of technical assistance funds to local governments and nonprofit organizations across the watershed. So on the left, you can actually see, I pulled this from the ethnographic assessment framework, reasoning behind both the top-down and bottom-up framework for how the DCI program was incorporated into the SAPA. And on the right, you'll see some outreach events that we had. The top left is one of the Watershed Ambassador workshops. Top right, one of community water conversations. So a follow-up to the community listening sessions that were first held for the ethnographic assessment. And this one in particular was Quail Valley and their local Eastern Municipal Water District on a project there. And then on the bottom two images on the right, we actually managed to hold a day-long tour of the watershed with DWR staff and one of our project partners touring some of the technical assistance project sites that are being funded through SAPA's DCI program. Next slide, please. I'd be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge the DCI program would not have been possible if SAPA had not collaborated with a host of community organizations as well as statewide partners. So in addition to SAPA, the DCI program partnered with UC Irvine, CSU Water Resources and Policy Initiatives, the Local Government Commission, California Rural Water Association, and Water Education Foundation. And all of these partners, in addition to other community organizations as well as local governments, were very crucial to the implementation of this program. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight a few of the activities. Some I have already discussed, but this is not an exhaustive list of the DCI program. Due to time, I'll just go through a few of the things that my co-fellow Karen Valladares and I worked on throughout this year. So most of the ethnographic strength and needs assessment was done in previous years, both between SAPA staff, previous CivicSpark Fellows, and with UC Irvine and CSU San Bernardino, and as well as other authors as well. However, Karen and I were able to attend the community water conversations in Quail Valley and City of Santa Ana during the fall of 2019. In addition, we also assisted SAPA in its tribal outreach efforts. So we met with both federally and non-federally recognized tribes with ties to the Santa Ana River watershed to better understand and hopefully in the future better collaborate with tribal voices. In addition, we helped assist SAPA with the translation services that were fully funded through DCI programs. So over 55 document translations ultimately were provided to local governments and nonprofits throughout our service year. Another thing we did was community water internships. So we, through the administration from CSU San Bernardino, Karen and I periodically checked in to interns as well as provided seminar trainings to local college students who are matched with local organizations to work in internships funded by a DCI program on community water issues in the watershed. And some of you in attendance may also be familiar with the Watershed Ambassadors Program, which were the 3 rounds of elected leader trainings that connected water agency officials and other community groups and policymakers around the watershed. And these were 3 rounds mainly led by LGC, but we helped with some of the logistics in September, January, and June. And last but not least, like I mentioned before, the technical assistance projects were Firstly, we, in the beginning of the year, we helped with the fall 2019 application in collaboration with the previous CivicSpark Fellow, Marisa Perez-Reyes, who was still at SAPA at the time. And throughout 2020, we assisted SAPA with invoicing and fund disbursement of for technical assistance projects, of which 18 are included in the SAPA region. Next slide, please. So 3 of the lessons learned throughout my service year is that mixed messaging from water agencies and public officials on local water issues can result in some miscommunication and sometimes ultimately end up in a lack of trust. This is especially true, we found, with non-English speaking communities. Even though Santa Ana Watershed has a huge proportion of non-English speaking population, a lot of the legal lingo or the policies are mainly in English. So one of the recommendations from the ethnographic assessment actually is to hire more multilingual staff, as well as providing more multimedia in multiple languages, especially Spanish and Vietnamese, but also other languages spoken in Watershed. This also ties into understanding under-resourced communities' concerns more, rather than just going in with a set project. First listening and actually doing outreach to communities and learning about what their concerns are around water issues. And actually from this process, from the assessment, we found that actually there was a wide distrust actually, or rather not a wide distrust, but there is a general distrust of tap water, not just in rural communities, but also in certain urban pockets around the watershed as well. So water agencies can improve upon some of the messaging in order to combat some of this distrust, and also understanding there are legitimate water concerns about tap water in some cases as well. And this moves on to the next point, in which agencies have to maintain a balance between immediate concerns such as seasonal flooding and day-to-day water use with the long-term issues of climate change and water scarcity. So water rate increases can adversely impact lower income populations disproportionately. So as a result, water agencies and local governments need to collaborate with local businesses, organizations, and community groups in order to develop best practices for conserving water use and replenishing local supplies, while also being mindful of the fact that water rate increases, and also just water rates in general, have a disproportionate impact on different communities. And lastly, we found that locals actually really are interested in their local water issues. So reframing narratives around what is considered water management will be crucial into future community collaboration. Historically, water resources management has been pretty top down in terms of infrastructure, maintenance, and ultimately community outreach hasn't been bottom up for the most part. So through the ethnographic assessment, through our community outreach, and hopefully beyond the DCI program, in the future, SAPA and other water resource management agencies can first reach out to communities rather than doing it from a top-down level, and understand how different needs for water issues are also considered water management and isn't necessarily tied to just water engineering. Next slide, please. And yeah, so thank you everyone for listening to my presentation. If anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to me through my email, or also questions right now.
Yes, we do have some time for questions.
And actually, since I know I had to rush a little bit, but maybe going back to the first slide so people can see that slide a little bit more.
Allie, could you really quickly just touch on how that ethnographic approach to the strengths and needs assessment better set you up to address those, identify and address those needs?
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, most of the ethnographic assessment work was done by prior CivicSpark Fellows. And actually, I believe Marisa is actually on the line here. So thank you for all of your work in the previous years. So the ethnographic assessment, it used a lot of collaboration from a lot of the knowledge from UC Irvine, especially their Department of Anthropology and Newkirk Center for Science and Society. So they had a lot of existing networks to local nonprofits as well as local community members, and all of those sessions really informed how Karen and my service year went about. Not only just doing a further outreach, but also developing the criteria and ultimately selecting the projects for technical assistance funding.
Thanks, Bailey. This work has been a long time coming.
Yeah, definitely. And also thank you to LGC staff as well. And the list of people that have helped me throughout this year is just extensive. So yeah.
So we will move on to Aman's presentation.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Aman Patheja, and I am the CivicSpark Fellow for the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority and Council of Governments. And today I want to talk to you about Resilient IE, which is a collaboration between WRCOG and SBCTA to support local efforts to mitigate climate risks and work on transportation and community planning. And the way it does this is in 5 key areas. So first, there is a newly established regional climate collaborative, the Inland Southern California Climate Collaborative, which is essentially a collaboration of the main players between San Bernardino County, Riverside County, and Imperial County in terms of local agencies, CBOs, and any other players in the climate field. In addition, there are sub-regional vulnerability and adaptation strategies created for San Bernardino County and Riverside County, city-level climate transportation hazards and evacuation maps, and in general, a regionally tailored climate resilience guidebook for transportation infrastructure in specific. All of these will be combined into a comprehensive document that would sort of highlight all the key details from the previous 4 as a template resilience element toolkit. The legislative mandate for this project is SB 1000, which is the Environmental Justice and Local Land Use and Planning Act, passed in 2016. In legalese, it defines it as the fair treatment of all peoples, races, cultures, and incomes with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. But in essence, what this is trying to do is to bring the topic of disadvantaged communities and environmental justice in the planning aspect and to have it be present in all parts of the planning process. So the part of this project that I had a hand in was the San Bernardino County Vulnerability and Adaptation Strategy documents. And the main focus of these documents is that San Bernardino County will be facing a lot of climate hazards over the next 50 to 100 years. Most notably extreme heat, air quality, wildfire risk, drought, and landslides. So these are not all separate. They are interconnected and can affect one another and create these negative feedback loops. For example, the county is expected to have an increase in extreme heat days by anywhere average 27 to 50 days by 2050. The increase in extreme heat days will lead to a greater wildfire and drought risk. This will also strain the transportation infrastructure and lead to worse air quality as there's more driving and whatnot in the region. The issue is that vulnerable communities can bear the brunt of these effects in roundabout ways that may not be considered initially. For example, it gets hotter outside, it's 10 a.m., 95 degrees. It's not that big of a deal. You can just put the AC a little lower in your car. But if you are walking to a transportation hub, it matters a lot, especially if there is no tree canopy in your city, so there's no shade. Maybe there are no sidewalks or anything. These are the ways in which they have downstream effects down to the vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. So here is a map of San Bernardino County. One thing to note is that San Bernardino County is the largest county in California and also the continental US. And so when planning for this, we have to take into account that we do not have a homogeneous population and a homogeneous distribution. For extreme heat, we have, you can see in the slide, over on the west side, where there are more cities, especially on the southwest side, there you'll only have an increase about 30 days, whereas further on the east side, out closer to 29 Palms, Lake Havasu City, that's where you get an extreme heat increase of up to like 50 days. And so you can't make a general plan to cover everyone. You have to really take into account what communities will be affected by which issues in particular. Next slide. In a similar vein, not only in extreme heat, but in general, social vulnerability can be linked to, or can be mapped onto the specific locations within the county. And it's not so much that we kind of have to do it for everywhere. We have to recognize which issues are impacting which cities. Next slide. So where do we go from here? The Resilient IE Toolkit was completed February of 2020, although there are still some minor delays with the current situation going on. But this is a sub-regional high-level toolkit. How do we convert these ideas and principles into actions that we can have in our cities? For this, I researched the Healthy Communities program in Rancho Cucamonga. But I guess first I need to define, or at least imply that, for me at least, environmental justice cannot be extricated from public health. They are intertwined, and the public health effects of what's happening in the environment is not something that we can ignore for our communities. And so the Healthy Communities is a region-wide SB County initiative to promote a positive physical, social, and economic, or to promote a positive economic environment. And the biggest strength of this program is the Health in All Policies framework, which is essentially a framework where we take these external public health considerations that are present in all levels of policy making and really take them into account, really plan around them. If we're going to be planning some new streets, we have to think about the air quality that's going to affect from that street and think about which neighborhoods are nearby, little things like that. And so the reason I chose Healthy Communities is because they walk the walk, so to speak. And one example of that is that the city I live in, Rancho Cucamonga, they have been working with Healthy Communities and have been creating some additional policy inputs for their 2020 general plan update. One such example is the policy PS 11-2, which policies apparently have a very complicated name, but essentially it's just minimizing vehicle emissions by encouraging alternate land use patterns. This is essentially taking something that comes down from state legislature, going to the Resilience IE Toolkit. Now we have a general framework of what to do, and the next step, taking it to the city planners, and that's how we bring it into our communities. Thank you.
Questions?
Question from Alexandra. To what extent did the Transport Authority engage with the Department of Public Health in recognizing effects of prioritization and planning?
So we had the Chief of Planning, Josh Lee, reach out to the head of the San Bernardino Department of Public Health. And I think through them, there was a process. However, this was completed, the initial research for the vulnerable communities was completed in, I believe, 2017, and that was before my service year. So I know that there was a process. I don't know the specific details, but I could look that up for you.
Any other questions? Awesome presentation. Thanks, Aman.
Thank you.
And now we have Allie's presentation.
Hi, thank you. My name's Allie Hoff, and my project focused around equity, inclusion, and empowerment in community climate action planning groups, specifically within Drawdown, Marin, within the county of Marin. So Drawdown Marin is a community driven campaign to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the county and reverse the county's impact on climate change while preparing for climate change impacts and adapting to those. And we were awarded a grant from the Marin Community Foundation. Drawdown Marin partnered with community leaders of color to design an approach to foster deeper engagement of people of color in Drawdown Marin, and was awarded a grant to do this. And then I came on in September to work on helping build capacity in this area and implement this grant, working with those community leaders that designed the grant and process, as well as Drawdown Marin's coordinator and existing participants of Drawdown Marin and community members that are not yet involved to get them involved, help them feel empowered, and kind of remove blockages to engagement and participation. Everything on this slide's kind of a summary of what's in the rest of my presentation. So if we can move to the third slide, actually. Yeah. So this is just a little background to help you understand why this was a priority for this climate change initiative within this county. So the county of Marin was rated the #1 most racially disparate county in the state of California. It's also very racially segregated. So although there's about 30% of the population that's not identifying as white, they're all kind of this part of the population is predominantly living in a few specific neighborhoods, and unfortunately that makes it really easy to see the disparate outcomes across areas such as race, poverty, and environmental burden and other socioeconomic impacts. And so this is just a little example of that, so you can see these 3 areas, and you can look into the specifics later, but race and environmental burden and poverty are all very directly correlated within this county. So it was a large priority for the group to focus on making sure that not only the solutions that are climate solutions that are created are beneficial and appropriate for these communities that are being impacted disproportionately, but also designed by and implemented with the people that live in these communities. And so can you go to the last slide, please? Actually, 2 back. Yeah. So in order to do this, there was a lot of internal equity work that needed to be done to help the group of Drawdown Marin be able to be aware and work on internal dimensions of equity, normalizing it, operationalizing it, or normalizing it, organizing around it, and operationalizing it into the way that it worked within the group and the decisions and solutions it created. And then also we had a community facing portion, which I spent a good part of this year just showing up to events and just things that were happening in the communities that were to be engaged, that I lived in, to build relationships and trust and start to kind of understand what the common priorities are between this climate group and the people that care about those issues but aren't part of the group. So we had a ambassador program to kind of jumpstart the participation and involvement of community members from these more marginalized communities into shaping the climate solutions created by the group. And that got a little bit postponed and derailed due to social distancing and the impacts of COVID and the community organizations we were organizing through needing to focus on emergency response. But we're moving back towards that, and getting stipends to community members that would like to learn more about how the climate group is designing solutions and being part of those solutions, how they are designed and implemented within their communities. And then within the internal capacity building, also got a little bit slowed down because of not being able to meet in person, but we were able to redesign and have hosted an initial 3-part diversity, equity, and inclusion training just to set a baseline for all the group members to make sure we're all on the same page, have the same goals and common vocabulary around what racial equity means to the climate work that they're doing, and specifically within their community, which was really important because the group is not currently as diverse as it would like to be, and it needed to kind of get a little bit of a different perspective to see areas that it could grow in more. We also had developed an equity progress report as a tool for accountability that was called for by the community leaders that designed the grant process to be kind of like a benchmark process, and measure progress and hold accountability along the way. We founded an internal equity task force to continue this work when I'm not here, and I will be staying on a little over a month after my CivicSpark term to continue supporting the transition of having the internal equity task force and the community organizations and ambassadors moving forward in collaboration and involvement. I think I'm towards the end of my time, but there were so many lessons learned and valuable things that came out of the challenges that arose this year, mostly learned from just talking to people and being in the community. And I can't do it justice in 5 minutes, but most of them were kind of explained through the process. So thank you.
Thanks, Allie. And we do have a little bit of time for questions. There's one question in the chat asking about the stipends for the Community Ambassador Program.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak just broadly?
Yeah, so we decided in conjunction with the partners we had in the community that designed this process with us, that the best way to kind of help close some of the gaps and barriers to participation that were existing within Drawdown Marin was to offer a little bit of financial support to make it more feasible for people to take time out of their busy work lives and family lives. So it's like the plan is to have a monthly stipend awarded to each of the ambassadors that have signed up to do a certain list of tasks and kind of relationship building activities, discussing community issues, and then eventually having the opportunity to create or participate in existing community projects or form their own, which we also have funding for within the grant to help implement. So the stipends also are helping cover right now access to cellular data or internet connection, because that was the main barrier right now. Most people didn't have unlimited data or access, and that made a big difference. So yeah, thanks.
I just want to give Allie a shout out as a Marin resident and a member of the committee on which she was working. She really worked incredibly hard, and her supervisor's on maternity leave, so she's also been flying solo for a while, and just really appreciate all the voice you brought to these issues because it is desperately needed in Marin. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allie. Next we have Carrie.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to everybody watching and supporting me on Zoom today. My name is Carrie Simmons, and this year I served the County of Ventura Planning Division on 2 projects. The first was developing a program EIR for the general plan update, and the second project, what I'll be talking to you about today, is known as the Ventura County Insight Center. So some quick background is this project was actually developed out of a pilot project that the county was selected to participate in under the Southern California Resilience Initiative that had gotten board approval because it implements general plan policies and goals that specifically relate to environmental justice and wildfire resilience. So to kind of start off, the overall goal of the project, which is highlights those two aspects I just mentioned, is to gain a greater understanding of the vulnerable communities we have here in the county to better prepare, respond, and recover from destabilizing events, and therefore creating or improving community resiliency. The reason we focus on vulnerable communities is because it's a recognized need across county agencies, and also because of the highlighted need that these communities face risk and challenges every day, which are only exacerbated by disasters and the expected increasing threat of climate change that the county faces. So what really is this VC Insight Center? It may seem a little vague at first, but to broadly describe it, it's a strategy that is designed to understand communities through sort of an in-depth investigatory process. And this process uses both data and person-to-person interactions. So what does this strategy really look like? At the bottom left-hand of the screen, I have an infographic that lays out the broad overview, but I can briefly describe the key phases. So we first start with the project initiation. This is where there's a formation of an interagency committee between county agencies where they will identify stakeholders, assess appropriate vulnerable communities or impact areas that would work well with this strategy and have some needs that they want to understand. And so next gets into the preliminary research phase, and this is where there's targeted research projects to find distinct answers. And also this is where the county tries to do asset identification and assess all available public data sets so that we can create a comprehensive data inventory. Then is the data collection and analysis piece. The first part of this is where the county will be coordinating the person-to-person interviews, focus group sessions, and having meetings with trusted community members to try to get a more insightful and meaningful data and feedback from actual community members. And then following this, the county will also be working with community disaster response mapping programs to find on a neighborhood to neighborhood level any key findings or identify problems that happened with evacuation or emergency response at that neighborhood level. And so after all the data has been collected and compiled, staff will produce a community assessment, which we call an insight report, and it is going to provide a holistic and comprehensive understanding of who the vulnerable community is, where they are, what their needs might be, and also individual experiences that some residents in that community faced during natural disasters. And the final phase of this will be the interagency committee stakeholders and other partners putting together a key findings and implementation report. And this is going to really be an action plan to implement all the findings and eventually provide recommendations for possibly new or existing programs related to that community. And so a big success that I kind of want to highlight is that this project has a really amazing potential to be scaled and replicated across a wide range of impact areas, geographies, and communities across California or even possibly the country, because the strategy can easily be applied to a lot of places. And so I quickly wanted to just jump into the stakeholder engagement piece of this project, because the design relied heavily on input from over 50 stakeholders. The project lead and myself hosted 3 interactive workshops, which I got to help co-facilitate. And we hosted stakeholders such as county staff that was involved with disaster recovery efforts, staff highly involved with data systems and GIS, and then of course our local agencies and cities to get their input. And these workshops were sequenced so that they would build off each other, and one workshop would relate information to the previous workshop, so all these stakeholders could really be working together to build upon identified gaps and collaborate on solutions that the VC Insight Center could potentially provide. And so the input from the stakeholders did end up really heavily influencing our design, but most importantly, it identified what the first community that the project would be focusing on, and that is the Ventura County farm worker community. And so this really leads me into where the project is at now, since I was heavily involved in the design phase. Where the project is now is really getting to work on the farm worker insight project, which is the initial focus. And so an interagency committee has already been formed to start working to collect data and find stakeholders. And essentially they will go through all the strategies and the steps that I had just previously mentioned to understand the farm worker community, and specifically during the most recent wildfire events the county's faced in the past couple of years. And another quick update I just wanted to give on the project, and another huge success that has come from this, is that the project's been adopted by the Human Services Agency at the county. They've taken full ownership of it because it relates to a lot of their own outcomes and projects that they're working on. And it's also given them the ability to take this project and now apply for future funding mechanisms to really grow the project and make it successful. And so I quickly wanted to leave you with the long-term outcomes of kind of where this project has brought in the county and where we see it going. And so really it will help us develop best practices in dialogue development with hard to reach communities, and an investigation and reporting methodology. It allows for an increased, enriched data lake between county and other agencies by creating data sharing agreements so that we can readily share information on these communities. And finally, most importantly, it will increase resilience across the county, inclusive of all of our communities, and especially the vulnerable ones. And so that's all I have for you today. I want to say thank you to my team members, Clay and Susan, and our partners at Resilient City Catalyst, who launched the Southern California Resilience Initiative. I really enjoyed working on this innovative project and meeting all sorts of new people. And also shout out to Central Coast Fellows and Kaylee for this amazing year. Thank you again for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Any questions from our listeners or in the chat, or you can unmute yourself?
I got a quick question, because you plugged the replication here, and I'd love to know how other communities might be able to, and in what form they can get this from you to try and replicate it.
Yeah, so we had following, so once the Human Services Agency has kind of taken over the project, they have their own staff working on it, but we have a year-long work plan that was initially kind of established. And they'll be creating these documents and kind of following this first initial project with the farm worker community. The deliverables from this, such as the insight report, and also the key implementation goals report, can be reviewed by other agencies, and also can probably reach out to the head of the Human Services Agency who's taking on kind of this project. And really this exploratory year will allow us to kind of start making changes or recommendations to change the DC Insight Center in the future. But for other people who might want to follow this, I would say once these documents start being produced in the next year or so, to maybe look back in with the county or check in with the Human Services Agency.
Great job, Carrie.
Thank you.
And I believe we are on our last presentation for the day. I'll hand it over to Hannah.
Hi, I'd just like to say, if you're still here, thank you for waiting all the way to the end. I'll try and do the last presentation justice. Also, I wasn't originally in this category, but I do think that my presentation very much falls within the sphere of engaging vulnerable communities. So just a little bit of background about my project and my placement before I get into the work. So this whole year I've been working at the California Energy Commission in the Energy Research and Development Division Market Facilitation Department. And that might not be the most natural fit for an Engaging Vulnerable Communities presentation, but I'd like to explain why I'm in this department and why my project has focused on the city of Arvin and the city of Paramount from the state level. So the Energy Research and Development Division Market Facilitation Department runs the Electric Program Investment Charge, which is a ratepayer-funded program that invests in scientific and technological research to accelerate the transformation of the electricity sector to meet the state's energy and climate goals. In 2017, Assembly Bill 523 required that 25% of EPIC technology demonstration and deployment funding be allocated to sites located in and benefiting disadvantaged communities, an additional 10% allocated to sites in and benefiting low-income communities. So I just like to take a moment to acknowledge that disadvantaged communities is not the preferred term of communities, but it is the terminology used in the creation of the Cal-Enviro Screen 3.0 map, which identifies the 25% most impacted by environmental hazard communities in California. And so it is a tool that is used to identify which communities in California are designated as disadvantaged and which communities in California are designated as low income. However, I just would like to acknowledge that the term disadvantaged communities does not really describe these communities, and other terms such as under-resourced communities better show how the state has left some of these communities without investment for a long time. So through December 2019, technology demonstration and deployment projects funded through the California Energy Commission's EPIC program invested 29% of funds to projects in disadvantaged communities and an additional 36% in low-income communities. Despite the fact that these numbers are above the targets established in AB 523, the Energy Research and Development Division was a little disappointed with the volume of applications that they got for projects deployed in disadvantaged and low-income communities, and decided to apply for a CivicSpark Fellow to work within 2 disadvantaged communities in California to identify what barriers these communities face to accessing clean energy programs from the state. So the objective of my fellowship was to identify barriers local governments in and residents of disadvantaged communities face in accessing clean energy, and help further the connection between the Energy Commission's research programs and the energy policy goals of local governments and disadvantaged communities. My project for the year was to work directly with 2 local governments, the city of Paramount, which is located in southeast Los Angeles County, an industrial hub where people are overburdened by industrial pollution and smog from the freeway, and Arvin, an agricultural community in the Central Valley, where people are also overburdened by pollution, but this time it's coming from the nearby oil fracking wells and the agricultural industry that surrounds the community. Work with these governments to identify and break down the barriers that they face in accessing renewable energy from the state. And throughout the year, I've been working alongside the Institute for Local Government, a statewide nonprofit organization, as part of their BOOST program. The BOOST pilot program is a pilot program created by the Strategic Growth Council and Institute for Local Government, designed to help local governments work collaboratively to address California's—
Anna, we can't hear you anymore.
Sorry. Is this better? I love to touch my speaker, and I always forget that is how people hear me. Anyways, the BOOST pilot program was created by the Strategic Growth Council and Institute for Local Government to help local governments work collaboratively to address California's climate change and equity goals. This year, they chose 12 different communities across California to provide technical assistance to both Paramount and Arvin being selected as BOOST communities. And I specifically helped work within the BOOST framework on clean energy issues. So now I'm going to go through my projects in both Paramount and Arvin, and projects within the Energy Commission. So my main project in the city of Arvin was planning and organizing Arvin's first clean energy fair. Through this process, I facilitated weekly check-in calls with the Energy Fair Working Group to plan logistics, including an EV test drive, free solar raffle, clean energy prizes, food vendors, children activities, and entertainment. We tracked project partners through spreadsheets, recruited community-based organizations, regional nonprofits, state agencies, and utilities to host booths at this event to help get people signed up for programs offered by the state, local and regional governments, and utilities. It was very important to us that we had translators at the event, and no one was asked personal information because Arvin is a 97% Spanish-speaking community, and there's a deep distrust of the government in this area. So also we collaborated with the California Climate Investment Outreach Liaisons to create and share promotional materials. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, this event has been postponed indefinitely. The intended date was August 25th. However, we are hoping that on the other side, when people are able to safely gather, the work that we've done and the transition report provided will create a roadmap for those going forward to execute the fair as intended. Additional work done in Arvin was connecting the city staff to regional solar nonprofits, such as Grid Alternatives. Along with the city of Arvin, we have secured 3 solar installations to occur in Arvin through the Grid Alternatives, the statewide DAC-STASH program, and in the next few weeks are hosting a virtual webinar for residents of Arvin that want to learn more about the DAC-STASH program. Additionally, working with the Institute for Local Governments, I have created a survey for the city of Arvin to do a virtual community transportation needs assessment to help the city become aware of transportation needs within the community and apply for future funding around clean transportation. Now, switching gears to Paramount, which is in South Los Angeles County, one of the big gaps we noticed was there are so many programs for clean energy incentives and clean vehicle incentives, but they're so spread across different websites. There are different thresholds that need to be met, different application materials, different forms of contacting the service provider to get onto that service. So along with the Institute for Local Government, we developed content for the City of Paramount's website to provide Paramount residents with information on how to access state and local rebates, incentives, and discounts for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electric vehicles, effectively putting all of these programs into the same website. Additionally, one of the other gaps identified was lack of information about grant programs offered by the state for clean energy programs. So in response to that, we created a matrix of all relevant federal, state, and other agency programs, resources, and solicitations offering funding for renewable energy and energy efficiency programs for Paramount City staff to identify opportunities to advance their clean energy goals. Lastly, this has been a process that has also been delayed by COVID, but over the last month, I've been working with the Institute for Local Government and the consultant agency Environmental Science Associates to conduct a virtual community outreach for the City of Paramount's Climate Action Plan. This is still in the beginning stages, but we are working along with the city and community partners on creating a survey that we will distribute out into the community and host 2 Zoom events to make people more aware of the climate action plan process happening in their community and solicit feedback on what they view as highest priority. So where do we go from here? So I've also been working with the energy equity team within the Energy Research and Development Office within the CEC on planning EPIC events. EPIC events are events that occur right before the EPIC challenge solicitation is released. I've been working with the EPIC team on how to invite more environmental justice organizations to partner with these events and bring communities into the planning process. Additionally, I'll be presenting at the LCB meeting in September to the whole Energy Commission on my experience working with local governments this year and how the Energy Commission can make their programs and solicitations easier to access for local communities, especially those that have not applied for CEC grants before. Additionally, my main goal in this presentation is to advocate for technical assistance provided from the CEC to be part of the next EPIC challenge. All right, and that's my presentation.
Thanks, Hannah.
I know we're running long, but Hannah, I've got a quick question for you. You just said it right at the end, the sort of commitment to technical assistance. You know, you help 2 communities through this, set up programs and platforms that sort of bring resources together. Do you think that's an essential component of state support, is being able to help communities identify these things, put these platforms out there to move the needle?
Yes, completely. The Strategic Growth Council, SGC, just released a very long document about state agencies providing technical assistance. I can link it in the chat if anyone's interested, but it's a how-to guide for state agencies to put together technical assistance programs. It's been shown to be one of the main ways, the best ways to help local communities, especially those that haven't applied for past funding, access some of those dollars. I think what we've been seeing time and time again, especially with climate change investment, the California Climate Investments Program is the same, even within the 25% that's marked off for disadvantaged communities, it's the same disadvantaged communities that are able to apply because either they've done the process before, or they have a hired grant writer on staff, or the grant has a very high match funding requirement, and they're able to pay for that match fund with a former CCI grant. And so technical assistance, I think, is vital. And just also CEJA, which is the California Environmental Justice Alliance, every year comes out with a scorecard that rates state agencies on how they're doing on environmental justice. And this year, the California Energy Commission got an agency to watch, and the review was pretty positive, but one thing that they mentioned before they're able to give the CEC a positive score was that the CEC did not provide technical assistance on their EPIC program, which is exactly what I'm working on. So I was really happy that they said that in their review, and I think it hopefully will light a fire under the EPIC program to prioritize that going forward.
And it looks like there is interest in you sharing that resource from the SGC.
Yeah, one second. I literally just had it open, but I might have closed it. One second.
No problem. And with that, I'll transition to our closeout. It's been a pleasure hearing from you all. And a huge congratulations to all of the fellows. This is our last poster symposium presentation. And so we are wrapped up with that portion, but these presentations have been amazing and speak to the past year of service that has been challenging, clearly, but so much awesome work that's been done amidst challenges. We do encourage you to reach out to fellows, and you can find them on LinkedIn. We have their fellow contact information on our website, which I think Savannah can share out the link. She'll also be sharing out the website for registering for our graduation activities on next Thursday, the July 30th. It's our final graduation ceremony, where we will be virtually continuing and wrapping up this celebration of all you fellows. We'll upload the recordings of these sessions onto the website and share out to all attendees and registrants. And I think that is all. I thank you for all the participants for engaging and asking thoughtful questions and staying online. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday afternoon. And that's all from us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.